So, you want to know more about polls? Okay, their first documented appearance is from the United States. Polls are used worldwide, but Americans are overdoing it, which is interesting, but other arguably functional countries, even though they still trail behind in the number of polls per election cycle, have been producing more and more as well. Thanks to that, we now have an abundance of data, so everyone is able to consider whether polls should exist. I'll tell you about their history so we can all look at the present a little better, and about actual studies on how much and whether at all seeing polls influences other people's opinions. Which then brings us to the central question of this matter. Are polls useful or detrimental to the democratic process? But they are satisfying to read. They're like the manifestation of our voyeurism. Now that we know we can, we demand being able to peek into the living room of everyone in the area, so we see how they would vote, so we would vote accordingly. But wouldn't we all feel personally slighted if everyone saw our private voting choices? Time for the origin story. So why is the US so saturated with polls? I don't know. There was a 900% increase in the number of polls between the years 1984 and the year 2000. It wasn't always this heavily saturated with polls. There was a time when polls didn't exist at all. But for that we have to go back, way back, almost to the beginning. The early 1820s was a pivotal time in American history. 1820 was the last election won by a founding father, James Monroe, who won 231 out of the 232 electoral votes. Allegedly, he didn't win the last one because the electors said that only George Washington deserved to be elected unanimously. But now it was time for the young America to govern without even a single one of its fathers. And oh boy, did it get an existential crisis. 1824 election. The vacuum saw a total fracture in the contemporary political landscape. This period also saw white men without property be able to vote for the first time. So for the first time in forever, another aspect of elections could be taken into account: grassroots sentiment. Now if you built popular enthusiasm for your candidate, they could win, and press back then was vital in reaching the public. This was the last election where any politician dared to dismiss that popular support could play a role. For the first time you could see public gatherings, especially by the anti-Crawfordite faction, to demonstrate the support for their candidate. The resulting election came to be known as corrupt bargain. Now, in a politically fractured country, coalitions needed to be built so that the election did not have to be decided in the House, which they wanted to avoid unsuccessfully. The fact that the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, helped elect John Quincy Adams in exchange for the position of Secretary of State in his next administration was deeply controversial back then. Oh, how times have changed. Without this support, the supporters of Andrew Jackson insisted that their candidate would have won. While it wasn't about their objection to polling just yet, I think it allows us a great insight into the mindset of people back then, who were not used to today's climate of elections. The default environment was without the influence of middlemen, and that was considered the only rightful one to decide your vote in. Now that level isn't even assumed. Our default is who has employed the better salesman, not that salesmen shouldn't be there in the first place. And polls are, whether you consider them objective or not, one of those marketing strategies. As far as we can tell, the first straw poll was published on July 24th, 1824 in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvanian, and it showed that the local sentiments were inclined towards Andrew Jackson. Offering your opinion was voluntary. The collections were conducted in public gatherings, and while the sentiments of the country were captured accurately, it did not manage to predict the outcome of the election. In early August 1824, someone wrote to the Star and North Carolina State Gazette whether opinion polls will be conducted to test the strength of the different candidates. Other newspapers like the Raleigh Register opined that they disliked the practice, as it misrepresented public sentiment. Who was the mastermind behind having polls at all? We do not know, but we do know about a moment when someone first noticed that it could become a great product. It was this guy, nicknamed the British Gallup, Henry Durant. He headed the British Institute of Public Opinion in the late 1930s, and as he explained, people constantly asked us to put questions on our regular surveys, and at the beginning I was stupid enough to regard these as a nuisance. Then I suddenly realized that this was a beautiful way of making money. Other countries slowly adopted this practice during or after World War II to gauge the opinion of the public during the transition periods. Today, they are a fundamental building block of politics. But they also manage to touch something deeper in us. Not many marketing tools manage to intersect with deep human desires so well. But one of those is the obsession with what other people are doing and thinking. So a new graph-based reality show has emerged. How has it changed us? Several effects of polls are widely assumed even without the studies. The bandwagon effect. If you know what the majority thinks, that is presumed to be normalized and acceptable. And the majority opinion about something that you cannot otherwise independently verify serves as a sort of social proof. A thing must be true if the majority of people think so. And it's very hard to resist taking this into account, because even when you know that you are right, you kind of have to start wondering, wait, why is everyone around me insane? Is it me? But if everyone is conforming to everyone who is conforming to everyone, who dares say that the emperor has no clothes? Maybe if the crowd did not see that everyone else isn't reacting either, they would feel more motivated to speak out. And polls turn us all into bystanders, since we see the crowd around us distilled so perfectly into neat little numbers. So we know whether people are speaking out, and if they're not, why should I bother? So what do we know about the effects of polls? People who do not have a strong preference for a candidate are more likely to be swayed by a poll, but are also way less likely to encounter it, unless everything under the sun produces their own poll in an oversaturated space. We all assume that polls could change the opinions of other people, but you would be hard-pressed to find anyone specific who freely admits that they consider polling when forming their own opinions and voting choices. A 2005 self-reported survey from the UK revealed that only about 3.2% of voters consider poll standing in their voting choices. But if you break this down by demographic, the results are very interesting. 41% of people born after the year 1970 would be more likely to support a candidate who was ahead in recent polls. 14% of people with high school education or less, and 12% of people who are not politically active. Those trends are definitely real. In a study that tackled the 2012 Republican primary in Iowa, 15% of Iowans said they would consider frontrunner status as a factor when deciding who to vote for. From a national sample from that same study, 43% of people with high school education or less would consider it, and 25% of people with low interest in politics. But poll standing is merely a favorable trait, it is not an end-all be-all factor. There was a great, I guess what you could call partisan experiment, where people were given cards with summaries about a hypothetical political candidate. What was strategically swapped was whether this candidate was a successful business owner or a charity owner. You can already sense the partisan divide that would emerge from this. Yet still, there was an observed 11.3% increase in support for a candidate among young people when they were told about poll favorability. And if they were undecided, there was a pronounced effect where they changed their mind to support if that candidate was a frontrunner. What happens to a voter when they receive a poll that is positive about a candidate? And what happens when they receive a poll that is negative? When the poll shows them winning, it moves more people to support them, compared with a situation where they would see no poll. And when people get a negative poll about a candidate, the support decreases in that case, again compared to the neutral if they saw no poll, but not as much as it would increase in the opposite scenario. Can polls become self-fulfilling, self-reinforcing prophecies? Unfortunately, absolutely. Exposure to polls can bring about a difference in support for an issue by as much as 10 to 15 percentage points. The magnitude of these effects is inversely proportional to how strongly people already feel about it. I guess that's why making something into a new important issue is such a strong aspect of creating narratives, fairy tales, that solidify grassroots support. If you take an issue and reframe it into something urgent, almost civilization-breaking, and control the creation of what people who didn't think about it previously now do think about it, you basically won over their support for that. On highly contentious topics, people do actually look at how groups they identify with, or groups that they want to consider when forming their opinions, process the issue. And the effect is stronger if the framing is people like you think such and such about an issue. All the studies paint a picture that polls absolutely influence how we vote. But is that a bad thing? If polls did not exist, would you trust the average voter to decide elections correctly? I can see how someone comes to the conclusion from being presented all those facts that polls are useful and have a valid place in society. But personally, I do not think they are useful enough to deserve their existence, because they do interfere in the democratic process and not by negligible margins. But we have to consider that polls have evolved together with expanding voting rights. Truth is, we have no idea how elections would go if the world was suddenly completely without polls, especially today. But I found a few countries that had universal voting rights before they had pre-election polling. The Netherlands. What was different there? Very predictable electorate, and also they had mandatory voting. It's not that absolutely everyone voted, but a near 100% turnout eliminates most of the uncertainty that polls try to account for. Luxembourg, mandatory voting, tiny electorate, and incredibly boring politics. When new political parties emerged and it was no longer as predictable, Luxembourg started doing polling too. And, well, Germany, which was not doing great and then was doing even worse. After World War II, you can see how it was now pretty important to know what opinions people held. Why do polls exist? The feedback loop nudges us in the direction of the non-existent average voter, shaves off the extremes, and though they cannot prevent large-scale radicalization, because no one would actually do anything, at least we can know about it.